Hello. As the Vice-Chancellor mentioned, the announcement of the Yidan Prize doctoral winners was a key feature of yesterday's conference. We had so many high-quality submissions, and it was a very difficult choice to choose the 5 winners, and they will be meeting the Yidan Prize Laureates for 2021 when they're announced later this year in Hong Kong. So a fantastic start to their academic careers. It is now my absolute pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr Sobhi Tawil, who is the Director of the Future of Learning and Innovation team at UNESCO and leads the Futures of Education initiative. We couldn't think of a better speaker to deliver our keynote at a conference that looks to explore and challenge innovation in education. If you have any questions during Sobhi's keynote, please do type them into the Q&A, and we will be able to have a couple of questions at the end. Sobhi, we are really looking forward to hearing your keynote. I hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan, and thank you to the Yidan Prize Foundation for the invitation, and to Oxford University. It's really a great pleasure. And an honor. And I take this opportunity, since you mentioned Susan, to thank the Yidan Council of Luminaries also for their contributions to the ongoing work on the futures of education that we're leading at UNESCO. I must say that when first seeing the theme and the framing of the conference, I was almost a little surprised, but I thought excellent. I mean, to frame it with the question, what is innovation in education? I mean, at a time when the term is so overused that it's a buzzword, not only in education, also in business, in development discourse, and in politics. Innovation in all spheres of our lives is presented as being essential for the future. But answering the question, what exactly is innovation, is indeed a challenge, because it is a notion that remains blurred by lack of clarity. We know that there is no there is no common understanding of what is meant by innovation, and actually, it's perhaps not even a concept. It's more of a notion. It seems to command an intuitive understanding, but yet it escapes definition. So as a notion, a classic example of such a blurred notion is the notion of time. And as Saint Augustine, in fourth century theologian, the way he had framed time, what is time? If no one asks me, I know what it is. But if someone asks me to explain, I don't know what it is. So the notion of time, like innovation, but like other notions that permeate development discourse, capacity development, participation, and many others, it could even be called fuzzwords, to borrow a term from Andrea Cornwall and Deborah Eid in their Deconstructing Development Discourse analysis in 2010. But admitting this does not discount the importance of innovation in education or in any other sphere of development. On the contrary, it motivates us to better understand what it means, why it permeates our discourse, and how it shapes our actions. And if there is no singular definition, and there are many understandings of innovation, there are nevertheless a number of implicit assumptions. And it is important to look at them, not only to better understand, but also examining these assumptions can be important, because some of these assumptions may lead us astray and divert our energies, our focus, and our resources. So what are some of these assumptions? And I propose that we look at 3 of them. First assumption, that innovation is a positive disruption. often a sudden positive disruption. Hence, it's a good thing. Innovation is good. That's a first implicit assumption. Second assumption, that innovation allows us to leapfrog. Innovation is an opportunity to accelerate progress towards a desired outcome. And third assumption, that innovation in education is necessarily tied to is tied to technology. So let's consider the first assumption. Innovation is good. And today, innovation is almost systematically presented as something positive, a positive disruption. Innovation is good. It's welcome. It should be encouraged. But this has not always been the case. And Benoit Baudin, a Canadian scholar who researches the intellectual and conceptual history of innovation, has showed that the meaning has evolved significantly over time. In ancient Greece, innovation was used simply in a more neutral fashion, simply to describe a change to the law or to the constitution. In the Latin world, it became associated more positively with spiritual renewal. And later, after the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, innovation took on a rather negative connotation. It was seen as disrupting an established, desirable religious and social order, even a heresy. And it's not until really the 20th century, the second half of the 20th century, that innovation has been framed positively. Innovation became associated with technological advances, and seen as an instrument of progress and a source of productivity and of economic growth. So today the notion is used in multiple ways. I mean, it refers to a new idea, a novel idea, creating something new. Sometimes this is an entirely new idea, an invention. It can be an adaptation of an old idea, or the transposition of an idea from one context to another. And more than an idea, it's an application of a novel idea. So it's about doing things in new ways. It's about a new approach, a new strategy, a new process. And some, when speaking about innovation, refer to the mindset, the skills, the competencies that it requires, a combination of critical, visionary thinking, of curiosity, of creativity, of risk-taking. And Baudin argues that an underlying definition that connects these various uses of the term is, and I quote, a deliberate human change to something new. And this understanding is useful because it highlights the intentionality of change, a deliberate human change to something new. So we tend to like innovation because we like novelty. But Baudin highlights that really the key element is the intentionality of this novelty, of this change. In other words, the question of why change, why innovate, what is our ultimate purpose in innovating in education? And it's important to recall that, I think, because often innovation is seen almost in and of itself as the goal, whereas it's a means to a goal. Innovation is about improving the ways we are attempting to reach those goals. And so what are our goals in global education? Ensuring more inclusive, more equitable, better quality education, more relevant learning for all children, youth, and adults. In short, the broad goal of innovation in education is captured in Sustainable Development Goal number 4. Sustainable Development Goal number 4, which is our most recent formulation, let's say, of our collective commitment over the decades to ensuring quality education for all. And so the key idea that education should produce positive results, better and more relevant educational opportunities and social outcomes for all. And framed in this perspective, and this is how we see it at UNESCO, equity must be the central lens and the key criteria for judging whether a change induced by an innovation in education is positive and desirable. But unfortunately, I would say much of what we refer to as innovation in education is not always trying to get better results in terms of quality or equity. Often, it's about trying to get the same results or slightly better results with less. And this might be a transposition from the world of economics. Innovation is often about efficiency and less about quality and equity in education. And this is particularly true when technology is in the mix. So when attempting to define what is innovation in education, we really need to ask why innovation? What is the purpose? What is the aim? Why now? And we often consider that education and education systems are overly conservative, resistant to change. And that's true. But there's also a reason. Education is where our cultures, our societies, our worldviews are transmitted, are renewed. And changing education is really shifting the grounds beneath us in profound ways. So we can't, treat education as we would a new consumer gadget or an application. Maybe it'll work, maybe it won't. Let's test it out. Education is really too important to be left to chance. And sometimes we do introduce changes, sometimes disruptions, which are unnecessary. Disruptions of true, tried and tested ways of doing things. And if we take one example, literacy, we know how to teach. We know how to teach children how to read and write. We've known it for a long time. So why then all the innovation? Shouldn't we be focusing really on doing what we know works? Why all the investment, all the energy in finding different ways of doing something that we understand quite well, we have a long experience with, and a wealth of evidence to back it up. So important to say that we should not change what is not broken, or we should not change necessarily what is working. So in this case, in a lot of innovative experiences around teaching reading skills, is this really innovation, or is it unnecessary disruption? And we could say that also many innovations do not necessarily move us towards the goal we're striving for. In the U.S., in following the economic crisis in 2008, the federal government established a $1.5 billion fund, Innovating in Education Fund. And 10 years later, in assessing and evaluating those innovations that were funded, were supported by the Education Department, it was found that less than 20% of them had improved student achievement, which was the main criteria used to assess these. So, this experience, tempers a little bit. This evidence, it tempers our enthusiasm for educational innovation, which is across the board, whether that's tech-centric or not. And the evidence also highlights that learning is ultimately about changing human behavior, and that we know that changing human behavior is challenging, we also know that it's shaped by a myriad of factors, and formal education alone is only part of that larger puzzle that shapes human behavior and even educational outcomes. So it comes as no surprise that some of the most important innovations in education go beyond teaching and learning. And some of these innovations can really change behaviors. And take an example we're all familiar with. I mean, the introduction of free or subsidized meals in education is really a classic example of how a non-educational intervention really did improve more equitable and help us to move towards more equitable access and participation and outcomes in education. So we mustn't lose sight, and that's the first. In response to that first assumption that innovation is always positive, we mustn't lose sight of the ultimate goal of improving equity and quality for learners in their communities. Innovation in and of itself is not the end goal. It's a means towards our goal, and it shouldn't divert our energies in striving towards that goal. Innovation can be a good thing, but it's not systematically the case. And we should also be cautious of claims that disruptive innovation and change can also allow us to skip steps and accelerate change in sudden ways. And this is quite rare. And this brings us to the second assumption, and that is that innovation can allow us to leapfrog. Not only do we think innovation is broadly positive, but we also expect it to do miracles in a way, despite the evidence that this rarely happens. And perhaps we've made a mistake in applying the lens of technology to societal development, including education. I mean, exponential growth is quite normal in technology. There's nothing exceptional about an iPhone getting a faster and faster processor each year, or big improvements from 4G to 5G. It's a logic of exponential technological growth, but we often apply an expectation of exponential gains to other sectors of society, and we can't apply that same logic to social or educational change, which is more incremental. We can't quickly solve the crisis of out-of-school children and youth. We have made progress in recent decades, but we have seen that it takes a long and concerted effort, and we still see the challenges of reaching the hardest to reach. And there are many examples of disruptive innovation that was intended to allow us to skip steps, to leapfrog. It's the case of massive open online courses. The initial promise of expanding, quality higher education in a more inclusive manner across the world did not really play out. Recently, MIT researchers have produced data that, documents, the low completion rates of courses, a slight decline in enrollments in MOOCs between 2014 and 18. But also the fact that the MOOCs, which were presented as this transformation of higher education and an ability to jump a couple of steps and to democratize access to higher education, did not happen. And the data that they have on student enrollment showed that the overwhelming majority were from high-income countries, and less than 2% were from countries that we would categorize as low. At low levels of human development. So the dramatic transformation that was initially hoped for and spoken of in terms of higher education and democratizing access around the world did not occur. Another example would be the one laptop per child project. And the Charisma Machine, Morgan Namie's study, traced the initial utopian vision at the heart of the project when it was initiated in 2005, but traced also the challenges and the subsequent failures. And her fieldwork in Paraguay in 2010, showed that half the kids who had received the laptops were actually not really interested in using them. The laptops and their functioning were already old at that time. For some 15% of the children, the laptops were no longer functioning. Actually, were broken, and many of the rest who were using them were actually using them to surf the internet, to listen to music, to watch movies, and really a small share that finally were using the laptops in what we would consider to be a productive, educationally productive ways. So in 2010, and of the 4,000 students with laptops, her estimate was that 1%, 40 of them, were actually doing anything educationally really useful. So here again, the transformation that was envisaged and the possibility to jump steps to leapfrog did not really materialize. And it's interesting to see one of her overall conclusions, which comes as no surprise to any dedicated teacher or educator. And she says, I quote, "People are what make education what it is. Learning is social." So rather than disruptive innovation that allows us to skip steps and to leapfrog, we need incremental change. We need incremental improvement and a slow march in innovation. The idea of skipping steps, of leapfrogging to desired destinations, is perhaps even a terrible metaphor, terrible image. And it's the long, slow march which is more accurate. And this is where we need innovation, one step at a time. The notion or the image of leapfrogging really permeates international development discourse. But if we keep to the animal world, these leaping frogs are solitary creatures. They jump and live on their own. And perhaps if we wanted to keep with an animal analogy for notions of innovation, we should be thinking more perhaps of ants. Ants walk where others have. They follow trails and paths. And when they deviate slightly. They deviate slightly to explore and then to bring back the information to the wider community. And ants work for and with a team. They vary their speed based on need. They're almost always productive, and unlike the frog who leaps only irregularly and alone. So if we were to keep with that image, it's really innovation is about maintaining what works and innovating and putting our energies in innovating with things which are working less well or not at all. It's incremental. It's about a process of co-creation, and it must be a collective process. So we've looked at the assumption that innovation is good, how it can help us leapfrog, and the third and last assumption I'd like to look at is that innovation in education is about technology. And it's true that in many contexts, schools have invested Educational authorities have invested sometimes millions of dollars on cutting-edge applications, new initiatives, state-of-the-art technology. Technology futurists have promised that the next best thing will revolutionize learning forever. In some cases, we've heard that technology will actually replace teachers. And experts said this already some time back about videotapes and laser discs. Later, we heard it with the internet, with adaptive learning platforms, and now with the artificial intelligence. But the focus on technology fails to address the human and the social nature of learning. People, not technology, drive motivation. And I'd like to suggest that the most significant, the most important innovations in education probably have nothing to do with technology. Often they don't even get labeled as innovations because we're so habituated to be thinking about innovations in innovation in education in terms of technology or associating it with technology. But intentional change, as we said earlier, doesn't say anything about technology. And some of the major innovations in the history of education is perhaps the fact of making education secular, of including girls, of making it universal, making it free, making it compulsory, providing services at schools that have little to do with academic learning. We mentioned free or subsidized meals. And we could argue that the most important pedagogical innovations often have nothing to do with technology. Our obsession with technology as a path to positive change is overblown and misguided. And we could thinking of the past year, we've heard a lot about innovation since the COVID disruption, the educational disruption that came with COVID and the public health measures as of last year. But imagine if the disruption last year was not closure of schools. Imagine for a minute that we had global internet shutdown in 2000 and last year in 2020. Would changes and adaptations in education still have been labeled innovations? Would we have been talking about leapfrogging? Perhaps we would have had more interesting and varied innovations. So I think what is we have seen some. I mean, definitely, and unrelated or maybe as a consequence of the school closures and some of the we've seen we've seen some innovation in assessment and examinations, in curriculum, but I think the important point is really that social innovation is the innovation that we should be paying attention to. And when we are referring to technology in education, then it's also technology for social innovation. So returning to our question that frames the conference, what is innovation in education? I'd say one, we have to keep in mind why innovation. What is the ultimate purpose? And not lose sight of our goal of wanting to improve educational opportunities for all, and that not all innovation, change, and disruption is helpful as we strive towards this. Second, that we must avoid unnecessary disruption when things are working relatively well, and that improvement is incremental. It's rarely sudden and massive. It's rare that we leapfrog despite the frequency with which we come across the term. And it's interesting to cite here from Google's 8 principles of innovation. I just wanted to pick out a few of them. And this is Google, a tech company considered to be an innovation leader and pioneer. echoes some of these ideas. One, have a mission that matters. The idea of purpose and not losing sight of purpose. Second, think big, but start small. Here I'm quoting from Google's 8 Principles of Innovation. Think big, but start small. So ambitious ideas, but not necessarily sudden, massive, disruptive change. And strive, and I quote from them here as well, strive for continual innovation, not instant perfection. So the idea of the long march of incremental improvement. So in conclusion, the most meaningful innovation in education is really social. It looks at education in its wider context, a more holistic approach, something that the Yidan Prize has paid much attention to. And it's a type of social innovation that we will be hearing from some on the panel in a few minutes, and perhaps to cite Dr. Chen here because he frames it very well in saying that innovation is about creating sustainable social value. Thank you very much.